So it is Friday, April 17th, 2026, and I think it's safe to say the world has just sort of collectively exhaled,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone was holding your breath for the last 2 months.
literally. But before we get into the timeline of what just happened,
Yeah.
I want you, the listener, to just take a second and look around the room you're sitting in right now.
Just like take a quick inventory of everything around you.
Right, like really look at the physical reality of your immediate surroundings. You've got the plastic casing on whatever device you're playing this audio on.
Yeah, or the synthetic fibers in your rug, the structural parts of your furniture.
Exactly. And think about the fuel that transported the food sitting in your kitchen right now, or the electricity that's keeping the lights on above your head.
It's basically everything that makes modern life possible.
Every single thread of that modern comfort, all of it, relies on this dangerously fragile, like 21-mile wide strip of water halfway across the world, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, and honestly, calling it 21 miles wide is being pretty generous.
Really? How so?
Well, when you look at the actual navigable shipping lanes inside that strait, the deep water channels that can actually fit those massive supertankers, it narrows down to just 2 miles in each direction.
Wow. Just 2 miles.
Yeah, with a 2 mile buffer zone in between. It is this microscopic needle's eye. And basically, the lifeblood of human civilization has to thread that needle every single day.
And over the past 2 months, right, February and March of 2026, we all watched that needle's eye close.
Which is still just crazy to think about.
It really is. So today, we are going to map out the mechanics of the largest oil supply disruption in history. We're doing a deep dive into an unprecedented shock that brought the global economy to the absolute brink of total structural collapse.
Triggered by the U.S. and Israeli strike campaign and then the subsequent Iranian retaliation.
Right. And we're going to unpack this radical 11-party multilateral proposal that's been laid out in the sources you all sent us. It's called the Delhi Framework.
It's essentially the proposed exit ramp to prevent us from falling into a permanent global recession trap.
Exactly. And I have to say, the sources we're using today, specifically these really detailed excerpts from the Barack Face blog chronicling the 2026 Iran war, they are just fascinating.
They completely rewrite the rules of what we thought global security looked like.
Okay, let's unpack this because the reality of how this crisis unfolded is terrifying, but it's also deeply, deeply complex.
For decades, military planners and economists just assumed that a blockade of a major choke point would look like something out of a World War II movie.
Right, like warships lining up hull tall, physical barricades in the water, stuff like that.
Yeah, traditional naval engagements. But this crisis proved that modern economic blockades aren't fought with destroyers. They're fought with actuaries.
Actuaries and algorithms, yeah.
Yeah.
And maritime insurance policies. But real quick, a quick note as we start. We are looking at highly charged, ongoing geopolitical events here involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, emotions are obviously very high right now across the board.
Completely. So our focus here is entirely analytical. We are mapping out the logistical realities, the macroeconomic ripple effects, and these proposed diplomatic frameworks.
Looking under the hood at the mechanics of the engine.
Right, exactly. We're not taking political sides on who is driving the car or endorsing the specific viewpoints in the source material. We're just trying to convey the ideas that are actually in the text.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
So to understand the economic fallout, we really have to look at the anatomy of the disruption first.
Like what actually broke in late February?
Right. The circulatory system of modern energy trade relies on the Strait of Hormuz. It carries roughly 20% of the globe's seaborne oil trade.
1 out of every 5 barrels of oil moving on the ocean passes through that tiny gap. That is wild.
It is. And on top of that, it carries a massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Mostly the exports coming out of Qatar, right?
Exactly.
Right.
For a long time, the global market kind of treated this extreme geographic vulnerability as just a theoretical exercise.
Like, sure, analysts knew it was a risk, but it wasn't a risk that was actually priced into a barrel of crude on a random Tuesday.
Right. Until late February hit. The strikes happened, the retaliation followed, and the theory became reality very fast.
And the numbers just dropped off a cliff. The source notes that in early March, oil flows out of the Gulf plummeted to roughly 3.8 million barrels per day.
Which is why the International Energy Agency labeled it the largest oil supply shock on record.
Just dwarfing everything else.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to put it in perspective, this single event instantly dwarfed the 1973 oil embargo.
Which defined a whole generation of economic policy.
Exactly. And it surpassed the massive energy shock we saw triggered by the war in Ukraine. But the actual mechanism of the closure was completely asymmetric.
Yeah, break that down for us, because Iran didn't just line up ships to block the strait, did they?
No, not at all. And that's the thing. If a nation attempts a physical naval blockade, a superior naval force like the U.S. Fifth Fleet can just sink those blocking vessels.
Right, you just clear the physical impediment out of the way.
Exactly. But instead, we saw a strategy built entirely on this concept of uninsurability.
Uninsurability. So, missiles, drone deployments, coastal defense cruise missiles.
Yeah, a formally declared management plan from Iran that basically warned foreign commercial shipping away from the area.
So they didn't even need to sink every tanker.
They barely needed to sink any. The true battleground here was actually in London.
Wait, London?
Yeah, the Joint War Committee in London, where maritime insurance risks are evaluated. Because at its core, shipping is fundamentally a financial exercise.
Okay, that makes sense. So you have the supertanker, right? And it's worth, what, over $100 million?
At least. And it's carrying a cargo of crude oil worth another $100 million.
Right.
So if the operator believes that vessel might get hit by a $20,000 loitering munition, they just halt operations.
Because the math just doesn't work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if they do decide to brave the journey, their protection and indemnity insurers, the P&I clubs, they impose what's called a war risk premium.
And normally that premium is pretty tiny, right?
Oh, normally it's a microscopic fraction of a percent of the hull's value.
But in a crisis like this...
It spikes. 1%, 3%, sometimes 5%.
So suddenly, a single voyage costs an extra $5 million just in insurance alone.
Right. And the economics of that voyage instantly collapse.
I really love the analogy the blog used for this. It's like imagining a city's main commercial highway.
Yeah, it's a great visual.
Right. Like, the pavement is totally pristine. There are no concrete barriers. The lanes are wide open. But there's a sniper hiding somewhere in the hills overlooking the highway.
And the sniper doesn't have to shoot every single delivery truck.
Right. The mere unquantifiable risk of the sniper shuts down the highway completely.
The physical space is technically open, but the psychological and financial space is totally closed.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit, because we've seen disruptions in shipping before. Couldn't the shipping industry just reroute? Like, go around Africa?
That's the immediate public assumption whenever there's a disruption in the Suez Canal or the Red Sea. Just reroute around the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah, it adds like 2 weeks to the journey and burns more fuel, but it gets there eventually.
Right. But the Persian Gulf is completely different. It's a geographic cul-de-sac.
A dead end.
Exactly. The vast majority of the energy infrastructure, the terminals, the pipelines, the loading facilities in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq, Qatar, they are all inside this cul-de-sac.
And the Strait of Hormuz is the only front door.
Right. So to reroute around Africa, a ship first has to get out of the Gulf.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a huge problem.
And there is no immediate substitute for Hormuz-scale transport. The overland pipeline networks heading to the Red Sea or the Gulf of Oman, they just do not have the spare capacity.
You can't just absorb 20% of global seaborne oil overnight.
You really can't. You can't magically teleport millions of barrels to alternative ports. And you definitely can't just conjure specialized LNG tanker fleets out of thin air.
So when Hormuz closes, that wealth of energy is just locked in the vault.
Trapped. And once that physical movement stops, the psychological panic in the markets takes over.
Because oil markets don't wait for shortages, do they?
No, they are incredibly forward-looking. They trade fear.
They don't wait for the physical shortage to hit your local gas station before they react. They price in the worst-case scenario the exact moment the risk materializes.
And we saw Brent crude, which is the major global pricing benchmark, just skyrocket.
It jumped, what, 10% to over 50% in a matter of days?
Yeah. Pre-war, the global economy was coasting on a relatively comfortable $70 to $80 per barrel. Suddenly, we breached 100.
Hitting peaks of $120 and beyond.
Exactly. And even today, mid-April, with the ceasefire actually holding, prices have only moderated to that $90 to $98 range.
The volatility floor has been permanently raised.
It has. And that price surge acts as an immediate regressive tax on the entire global economy.
It's a total domino effect. And the source breaks this down really well, moving from first-order consequences to these catastrophic second-order structural damages.
Yeah, let's look at the first-order effects because those are visceral for the listener.
Right, you drive to work and gasoline is suddenly exorbitantly expensive. Diesel prices spike.
Which immediately drives up the cost of freight and logistics for every single physical good in the supply chain.
Right. Airlines slash routes, ticket prices double. That's the immediate hit.
But the second-order effects are what dictate the survival of industries. Because oil and natural gas are not just fuels.
They are the elemental building blocks of modernity.
Exactly. Just look at global agriculture. The entire backbone of modern crop yields is synthetic fertilizer.
Specifically ammonia-based fertilizers, right?
And those are produced through the Haber-Bosch process.
Right, which is an incredibly energy-intensive chemical procedure.
Very energy-intensive. It relies heavily on natural gas, both as a heat source, but also as the fundamental source of hydrogen molecules to bind with atmospheric nitrogen.
So a natural gas supply shock instantly becomes a fertilizer production crisis.
Immediately. Fertilizer plants in Europe and Asia start scaling back or completely shutting down because the feedstock gas is just too expensive to operate profitably.
And then agricultural input costs skyrocket. The cost to plant a field of wheat or corn just surges.
And because of the built-in delay in agricultural seasons, a fertilizer crisis in March bakes in a catastrophic global food inflation crisis for the autumn harvest.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying. It just bleeds into everything.
Everything. Plastics, pharmaceuticals, asphalt, construction materials, they're all derived from petrochemicals.
So the cost of running industrial manufacturing plants becomes totally prohibitive.
And this creates the exact macroeconomic nightmare the International Monetary Fund was warning about. Unanchored inflation expectations.
Right, because inflation psychology is incredibly difficult to break.
Once it takes hold, yeah.
Yeah.
If businesses believe that energy constraints are just the new permanent reality, they preemptively raise prices across the board.
Just to protect their margins.
Exactly. And then workers demand higher wages to afford basic necessities.
And central banks get totally trapped. They can't just print more oil.
No, they can't. And raising interest rates into a supply-side energy shock risks triggering a deep stagflationary recession.
So the IMF recognized that this war premium in energy pricing was basically embedding itself into the bedrock of the global economy.
The projections were extremely grim. The IEA projected a sustained drop of 1.5 million barrels per day across 2026,
which threatened to wipe out all expected demand growth,
potentially causing the first annual decline in global oil demand since the lockdowns of the 2020 pandemic.
And not because people didn't need the energy, but because the system was physically choking.
Exactly.
It brings to mind that really brilliant metaphor from the blog. Oil is embedded in the global economy the way salt is embedded in the ocean.
That is such a perfect way to describe it.
Right. Like, you cannot extract it, you cannot restrict it without changing the fundamental chemistry of the water.
And to truly grasp the gravity of that chemistry changing, we have to look at the specific vulnerabilities of individual nations.
Because the pain wasn't distributed equally, was it?
Not at all. The assumption of energy security was shattered completely unevenly across the globe. Asia, for instance, the industrial engine of the 21st century, was acutely exposed.
Right. Economies like China, India, Japan, South Korea, they rely on the Persian Gulf for roughly 80% of their crude oil imports.
80%. The sheer volume of manufacturing output tied to that single maritime route is staggering.
And then you look at Europe. I mean, over the past few years, Europe underwent this massive, really painful infrastructure pivot to wean itself off Russian pipeline gas.
Yeah, they built floating regasification terminals. They completely rewired their grid to run on LNG brought in by sea.
But a huge percentage of that LNG comes directly from Qatar.
And every single drop of Qatari LNG has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
So by solving one geopolitical vulnerability, Europe walked straight into another one.
They absolutely did. And two specific countries became the absolute poster children for the fragility of modern energy logistics during this: the United Kingdom and Australia.
Let's dig into that, because those case studies were wild to read about. In early March, the UK faced a near-panic scenario, right?
Yeah, headlines were warning of having only days of gas left.
Days! Because the UK has structurally low natural gas storage capacity compared to its European neighbors.
Right. They only hold about 12 days of peak demand storage.
Wow. Compared to, like, France or Germany, who maintain deep strategic reserves that can buffer them for months.
Exactly. So when the flow of Qatari LNG was threatened, UK wholesale gas prices exploded by 70%.
70%. So the specter of rolling blackouts for an advanced G7 economy actually became a mathematically realistic scenario.
It did. And Australia offered an equally stark wake-up call when it came to liquid fuels.
Yeah, explain the Australia situation, because it's a bit different than the UK's gas problem, right?
It is. Australia has spent the last decade basically closing down its domestic oil refineries.
opting instead to import refined fuels like diesel, gasoline, jet fuel.
Right, importing them from mega refineries in Southeast Asia.
But those Southeast Asian refineries are entirely dependent on crude oil flowing out of the Gulf.
Yes. So Australia functionally outsourced its national security to a supply chain stretching across two different oceans.
That is just wow. So when the crisis hit, the data revealed Australia was sitting on roughly 29 to 39 days of liquid fuel reserves.
Which falls drastically short of the International Energy Agency's mandated 90-day strategic reserve benchmark.
So the immediate result was just mass consumer panic buying. Terrifying spikes at the fuel pumps.
Vicious political recriminations. The government actually had to start emergency planning for severe rationing.
But I think the deepest insight from both the UK and Australian experiences is how the source material redefines what a shortage actually is.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction.
Because neither the UK nor Australia literally ran out of fuel by mid-April.
The tanks didn't run dry.
Right. The lights stayed on. But the crisis was just as severe because the vulnerability wasn't physical depletion, it was price exposure.
Exactly. In a hyper-financialized, optimized global economy, a shortage does not mean there isn't a drop of oil left within your borders.
It means that the next drop of oil you're forced to buy on the open market is going to cost you 10 times as much.
You can have the physical molecules flowing through your pipes, but if your economy has no strategic buffer, no reserves purchased at normal market prices to average down your costs, you are buying survival at absolute panic prices.
And that just rapidly drains capital from households. It eviscerates corporate balance sheets.
And it forces the government to step in with massive debt-fueled subsidies just to keep basic logistics functioning.
So the economic destruction is functionally identical to a physical shortage. The wealth of the nation is basically vaporized just to maintain the baseline functioning of society.
It's the dark side of just-in-time logistics.
Yeah. I love this analogy from the deep dive. It's exactly like running a major metropolitan hospital with only 2 days of backup oxygen on site.
Because daily deliveries are cheap and reliable.
Exactly. The hospital optimizes for cost efficiency instead of resilience. But then a massive blizzard hits, and the trucks can't get through for a week.
The hospital doesn't run out of oxygen on day one, but the administration is in total panic.
Right. They have to charter emergency helicopters at extortionate rates to fly oxygen in. They survive the blizzard, but the cost of surviving day 3 bankrupts the hospital.
The physical reality hasn't caught up, but the financial catastrophe has already occurred.
Modern civilization has just optimized away its shock absorbers.
It really has. And when you build a global economy on just-in-time supply chains, you effectively weaponize risk.
Any actor capable of disrupting that timing holds immense leverage.
Which really explains why the crisis couldn't simply be resolved by deploying overwhelming naval firepower.
And I think that's the natural question for anyone watching this unfold, right? Like, if the United States has the most powerful Navy in the history of the world, with these massive aircraft carrier strike groups, why couldn't they just force the strait open?
Just escort the tankers, sweep the area, and guarantee the flow of commerce.
Yeah, exactly. Why doesn't that work anymore?
Because the calculus of maritime warfare has fundamentally shifted toward the asymmetric actor.
Meaning the guy with the cheaper weapons.
Basically, yes. The 2026 conflict proved that cheap, dispersed, abundant precision munitions drones, anti-ship ballistic missiles, coastal cruise missiles, they can paralyze a waterway just as effectively as a massive fleet.
Because a U.S. destroyer is a billion-dollar asset with highly sophisticated interception capabilities, sure, but the math is entirely against the defender.
It's the economics of interception. You are firing a $2 million interceptor missile to shoot down a $20,000 drone.
A drone that's targeting a commercial tanker carrying $100 million of crude.
Right. And even with U.S. and Israeli strikes heavily degrading Iranian launch sites and radar installations, the geography favors the dispersed actor.
Because they can use mobile transporter erector launchers hidden in mountainous coastal terrain. They just pop up, fire, and relocate in minutes.
It leads to a profound realization, which the blog states perfectly. A mine is a threat you can clear, but a missile threat is a risk you must price.
Let's hover on that for a second. A mine is a threat you can clear, but a missile threat is a risk you must price.
Yeah, because a naval mine is a physical object. You deploy minesweepers, you detonate the ordnance, the water is objectively safe, and the ships sail.
But a missile launch pad 200 miles inland introduces unquantifiable probability.
You cannot physically clear the airspace of a theoretical launch. Actuaries have to mathematicalize that uncertainty.
And the resulting insurance premium is so punitive that commerce just stops dead,
It transforms a military conflict into a global hostage situation.
where the hostage is the interconnected supply chain itself.
Exactly. And the outcome was mutual economic self-harm on a planetary scale.
Asia bled through inflation and industrial slowdowns.
Europe bled through exorbitant LNG costs.
The Gulf states, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they were sitting on vast oceans of crude oil, but watched their revenue streams dry up because they couldn't export it.
The U.S. faced immense inflationary pressures threatening to tip a delicate economy into recession.
And Iran faced direct kinetic bombardment alongside severe economic strangulation.
Everyone was bleeding simultaneously. And it was the sheer unbearable weight of this global economic pain that eventually forced a temporary halt.
Right. On April 8th, a fragile ceasefire was brokered in Islamabad, Pakistan.
It provided a momentary exhale for the markets, bringing prices down slightly.
But time moves entirely differently for physical economies compared to global oil markets, doesn't it?
It really does. Physical economies run on a strict clock. Factories need power today, trucks need diesel tomorrow.
But trust in an energy market is a trailing indicator. It is rebuilt barrel by barrel, voyage by voyage.
You can't just sign a piece of paper in Islamabad, announce the strait is open, and expect maritime insurance syndicates in London to instantly drop their war risk premiums back to pre-conflict levels.
Because the psychological scar of uninsurability persists. Shipping companies wait to see if the ceasefire actually holds.
The market requires a sustained, empirically proven pattern of safe transit before capital feels comfortable flowing again.
And this brings us to the structural flaw of the Islamabad ceasefire. It stopped the immediate bleeding, but the source argues it's fundamentally incapable of producing a lasting settlement.
Right, because of the bilateral deadlock.
Yeah.
The primary negotiations are basically taking place between Washington and Tehran, with Israel's security imperatives heavily influencing the U.S. posture.
And the demands on the table are not peace proposals. They are maximalist ultimatums.
Yeah, let's look at Washington's reported 15-point plan. It demands total Iranian capitulation,
Zero domestic nuclear enrichment.
the removal of all highly enriched uranium from Iranian soil,
The physical dismantling of major fortified nuclear facilities like Fordo and Natanz.
severe limitations on ballistic missile development.
The complete cessation of all regional proxy support, and the permanent, unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
It's a massive list. And on the other side, Tehran's 10-point counterproposal is a mirror image of unyielding national pride.
They demand formal international recognition of their sovereign right to enrich uranium,
The lifting of all primary and secondary economic sanctions,
massive financial reparations for the damages incurred during the war,
the total withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the Middle East.
the nullification of all UN and IAEA resolutions against them, and continued sovereign oversight over shipping lanes in the Gulf.
Both sides view the other's demands as completely absurd.
But strategically, both are right to think they have the upper hand. These bilateral talks are designed as a test of endurance.
It is two actors staring across a table, waiting for the other to break under the pressure.
And the fundamental problem is that neither side is going to blink because both sides genuinely believe they are winning the war of attrition.
Right, because the definition of victory is entirely subjective here.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. and Israel assess their overwhelming kinetic superiority, their intelligence penetration, and their ability to tighten the noose of economic sanctions.
And they conclude they hold the dominant hand.
But Tehran assesses its proven ability to paralyze the Strait of Hormuz, hold the global macroeconomic system hostage, and inflict intolerable inflationary pain on Western democracies right before election cycles.
And they conclude they hold the dominant hand. So the war shifts from a military contest to a grueling psychological negotiation over humiliation versus survival.
And governments driven by intense nationalism and ideological mandates do not voluntarily concede to humiliation.
So if bilateral talks are a guaranteed stalemate, generating this permanent cycle of fragile ceasefires, renewed strikes, and massive oil price spikes, how do we escape the trap?
Because the global economy absolutely cannot survive a permanent Hormuz risk premium.
Right. And this is where the sources introduce this radical evolution in diplomatic architecture, moving from the emergency triage of Islamabad to the operating theater of the Delhi framework.
The core premise here is that the Strait of Hormuz is not a regional waterway. It is a global macroeconomic asset.
Therefore, a sustainable resolution cannot simply satisfy Washington and Tehran.
It has to structurally integrate the vital interests of the Asian importers, the European energy markets, the Gulf producers, and the global multipolar powers.
So the proposal outlines an 11-party diplomatic summit to be hosted by India during the 2026 BRICS summit. The Delhi 11 basically turns a two-sided duel into a massive corporate shareholder negotiation.
The arithmetic of multilateralism completely changes the incentives. Let's break down the table.
Yeah.
You have the core combatants, the U.S., Iran, and Israel.
Then you have Oman serving as the regional stabilizer.
Right, leveraging its long history as a quiet, highly effective back-channel mediator between Western powers and the Gulf.
And you introduce France to represent European interest, specifically Europe's critical vulnerability regarding Qatari LNG, as well as France's historical involvement in regional nuclear diplomacy.
And then you integrate the geopolitical weight of the BRICS nations, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa.
And, crucially, the host, India.
India's role as the host is an incredibly calculated choice. They sit in the exact center of everyone's geopolitical Venn diagram.
Because they are strictly non-aligned in the military conflict, right?
Exactly. They have deep strategic defense and technology ties with the United States and Israel. But simultaneously, they maintain crucial historical energy and trade relations with Iran and Russia.
And most importantly, India imports roughly 85% of its crude oil. Their domestic economic survival is inextricably tied to the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy.
They have massive skin in the game. That gives them the unique diplomatic gravity to convene all parties without being dismissed as a Western proxy or an Iranian ally.
Delhi provides a symbolically balanced arena. Everyone gains a structural advantage they cannot secure through bilateral force.
Right. The U.S. gets nuclear verification mechanisms backed by the leverage of China and Russia.
China and India secure the stabilization of their vital industrial supply lines.
The Gulf states guarantee their export continuity.
It relies entirely on the cold arithmetic of overlapping self-interest.
But there is an 11th seat at this proposed table that immediately jumps out as highly provocative.
Reza Pahlavi, the exiled crown prince of Iran.
Yeah, including the most prominent figure of the exiled Iranian opposition, seems completely counterintuitive if the goal is to get the current leadership in Tehran to agree to a deal.
Right. I mean, why would the Islamic Republic sit at a table that includes a man whose sheer presence fundamentally challenges their legitimacy to govern?
It is a brilliant, calculated deployment of a non-military pressure instrument.
The blog's defense of this is fascinating. It's not about the international community staging a sudden regime change in the middle of a summit.
No, it is about understanding the deep psychology of the Iranian leadership. The regime's ultimate existential dread is not an Israeli airstrike.
It is the total, irreversible collapse of their internal legitimacy, the fear of their own populace permanently rejecting them.
By placing a credible, unified alternative vision of Iran's future at the highest multilateral table, a vision explicitly advocating for denuclearization, regional normalization, and economic integration, the international community generates massive psychological leverage.
It sends a quiet, unambiguous message to the hardliners in Tehran. The survival of the Iranian nation is not inextricably linked to the survival of the current regime.
It reminds them that history is negotiable, and they are negotiating under the shadow of their own potential obsolescence.
It creates internal pressure for them to accept a painful diplomatic compromise now, rather than risk total destabilization and domestic collapse later.
Just incredible leverage. But even with perfectly calibrated psychological leverage and all the major global players at the table, the summit still has to solve the core physical impasse.
The irreconcilable demands over nuclear enrichment?
Right. The U.S. mandates absolute zero enrichment to eliminate any breakout capability for a weapons program.
But Iran mandates the sovereign right to domestic enrichment as a matter of scientific prestige and national dignity.
To square that circle, the Delhi framework incorporates the Russia fuel solution.
This is where the technical mechanics of the nuclear fuel cycle provide a diplomatic face-saver.
Exactly. The process of building a nuclear weapon requires thousands of centrifuges spinning uranium hexafluoride gas to highly enriched levels.
If you remove the centrifuges from Iranian soil, you mathematically eliminate the weapon's breakout risk.
Which satisfies the U.S. and Israeli security demands, but Iran still demands civilian nuclear power.
And Russia already operates Iran's commercial nuclear power plant at Bushehr.
So the proposed workaround is that Iran retains its civilian nuclear energy infrastructure, preserving its domestic prestige, but there is absolutely no domestic enrichment.
Instead, Russia manufactures and supplies all the finished physical fuel assemblies, strictly under the oversight and safeguarding of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Because a fuel assembly is a finished, manufactured product, it is vastly more difficult to reverse engineer a solid fuel assembly into weapons-grade material than it is to divide gas from a spinning centrifuge.
It is the ultimate political face-saver. Washington leaders can face their domestic electorate and declare they have verifiably neutralized the nuclear threat by removing all enrichment capabilities.
And Iranian leaders can face their populace and declare they successfully defended their right to civilian nuclear power against Western imperialism.
Diplomacy at this altitude isn't about achieving objective truth, is it? It is about constructing a narrative that all sides can politically survive.
That's exactly what it is. And if the Russia fuel solution breaks the nuclear deadlock, the Delhi 11 can push forward three vital deliverables to restructure global stability.
The first is a comprehensively verified cessation of hostilities across the entire regional theater.
And this cannot simply be a pause in direct missile exchanges between Israel and Iran.
Right. It has to mandate the verifiable stand-down of proxy networks, the cessation of maritime harassment, and the demobilization of asymmetric launch sites.
Because a ceasefire without disarmament is merely a reloading period.
So true. The second deliverable is the absolute permanent restoration of the Strait of Hormuz to its pre-war commercial status.
No lingering missile shadows, no ambiguous maritime management plans.
It must return to functioning as a transparent, reliable trade corridor, backed by international monitoring and guaranteed by the collective weight of the BRICS nations and Western powers alike.
And the third deliverable provides the economic incentive: phased, strictly reversible sanctions relief.
The relief must be tied directly and sequentially to compliance with the first 2 points.
It has to be structured so that Western politicians can instantly reverse it if violations occur, yet meaningful enough that capital actually begins flowing back into the Iranian economy.
Validating the political capital expended by Tehran to reach the agreement in the first place.
Exactly. And looking at this entire architecture, you see a clearly defined timeline for global stabilization.
In the immediate short term, the next few weeks, the focus is pure survival.
Deploying strategic petroleum reserves, coordinating emergency supply chain logistics, implementing demand reduction buffers.
Doing whatever is necessary to keep the lights on and the grocery store shelves stocked.
Then the medium term, the next several months, is the execution of the Delhi framework itself.
Transitioning from temporary buffers to a new structural reality. Trading verifiable regional security and the Russia fuel workaround for phased economic reintegration.
But the long-term timeline, the decades ahead, presents the most profound paradigm shift of the 2026 crisis.
We are attempting to run a 21st century hyper-connected digital civilization on a 20th century geographic trap.
The deepest lesson here is that the global energy system is fundamentally, structurally outdated.
True, lasting resilience requires systematically dismantling the world's reliance on a single 21-mile choke point.
This mandates a total reimagining of national security. It means aggressively expanding strategic liquid and gas reserves globally.
Ensuring nations like Australia and the UK are never again caught with only days of operational capacity.
It requires building massive redundancy into LNG import and regasification infrastructure.
And most critically, it forces a massive accelerated capital rotation into the energy transition. Renewables, advanced nuclear generation, and widespread electric vehicle adoption.
The 2026 crisis didn't invent the concept of green energy.
Right.
But it brutally stripped away the illusion that the energy transition is merely a long-term environmental aspiration.
It proved, through catastrophic economic pain, that transitioning away from a petroleum-based supply chain is an immediate, urgent mandate for national survival and global macroeconomic stability.
The crisis revealed the terrifying architecture of the modern world. The global economy is a magnificent, highly optimized skyscraper, but we have built it on incredibly narrow, precarious stilts.
We allowed the line between global peace and absolute economic devastation to shrink to 21 miles wide.
It is a profound realization.
The price of your weekly groceries, the viability of your retirement portfolio, the operational stability of the hospital in your city, all of it is invisibly, permanently tethered to the unhindered passage of massive ships you will never see, navigating a microscopic channel halfway across the globe.
And as we look to the future, the drive to escape the geographic trap of Hormuz presents a new, critical warning.
Yeah, the source leaves us with this really lingering thought.
As the global economy aggressively pivots to alternative energy grids, scrambling to secure rare earth minerals, lithium deposits, and entirely new, incredibly complex battery supply chains,
Yeah.
we have to ask a vital question.
Are we actually decentralizing our energy security?
Or are we simply blindly engineering the next inevitable geographic choke point for the conflicts of 2050?
Are we just trading one 21-mile strait for a different bottleneck in a different ocean?
It's a reality we will have to navigate very, very carefully.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, unpacking the fragility of our world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the forces shaping our future. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next one.